Once a Marine, always a Marine. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. There's a time to be born. James was born on August 3rd, 1930, to Robert Diggs and Marjorie Ann of Nashville, Tennessee. There's a season of living. God gave James exactly 81 years. The scripture tells us that he was blessed. There's a season to plant in a man's life. He was a Marine veteran who served during the Korean War. He worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for 35 years as a Corps drill operator. He was raised Southern Baptist and in his later years attended Sojourn Community Church in Louisville, Kentucky. He was married to his wife Patricia for 51 years. He raised 2 daughters. There's a time to die. James went home to heaven to be with Christ, his parents, his wife, and his great-granddaughter on his birthday, August 3rd, 2011. Psalms 116:15 says this: "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints." Today we're gathered to mourn. There's a season to mourn. He is preceded in death by his parents, his wife Patricia, his granddaughter Sonia Marie. Survivors include his daughter Marjorie of Sellersburg, Indiana, and Gail of Everett, Washington. His grandchildren, James, Charlene, and Andrew, and his great-grandson, Ephraim. There's a time to love and to embrace, and that time's now. Romans 12:15 says, "Mourn with those who mourn." There's nothing wrong with mourning. We're encouraged to mourn. Jesus himself, when he visited Lazarus' grave, cried. He wept. Why did he weep? He was mourning with those who were mourning. He knew what was about to take place. He still felt the heart of those he loved. This is a season to mourn. See, we mourn together because of his absence. James is no longer with us. Even though it is a temporary grief, and we grieve with hope because we know one day we too will be with James. This world is temporary, but even though it's temporary, we still feel the absence of James's life. He meant something to us, and we mean something to one another. There's a time to remember. I want you to take a moment for those who knew James and to think about in your heart what you're going to treasure about him. I only got to meet him once or twice, a couple times at church and once in his home. But I wonder what you're going to treasure about his life. Was it a phrase that he said or how he said it? See, remember those small but significant treasures that personally touched your life. Those were gifts from James, really from God through James. He was a once-in-a-lifetime gift to you and me. James 1:17 says that every good gift and perfect gift comes from heaven, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Now, James wasn't perfect, and none of us are, but he was a gift. He was a unique gift to us all. And there's a time to rejoice. Romans 12:15 says, "Rejoice with those rejoice." I want you to think about something. He's in heaven now, this very moment. He's not facing humidity outside. He's not facing suffering. He's not facing weakness. One of his family members shared with me that his mind would tell him what he wanted to do, but his body wouldn't let him. We can all attest to that to some degree. He's not experienced that now. He's in the presence of Jesus. The promises of heaven, he sits and is experiencing this very moment. Matter of fact, he's with the master sergeant of his life, Jesus. He made it home. He fought the good fight. He lived a full life, and now he's at rest forever. We can rejoice at the same time as we mourn, because we too have that hope of heaven. I got the opportunity to visit James in his home as a hospice chaplain. And what typically happens is when we get a new patient, I get a face sheet, and it explains how the directions how to get to the person's house, and a little bit about their history. So I went in and introduced myself, and I sat down, and James wanted me to sit right next to the table and talk with him. And so we sat there, and I kept looking at him going, "You look familiar. You look familiar." I'm thinking this, you know, and he goes, "Well, I can't mimic his voice, but I'd love to." But he would say, "Well, I wouldn't know where that would be," you know. And I said, "Well," and so on his face sheet it said Presbyterian Church, and I said, "Oh, okay, you go to a Presbyterian church?" And he says, "Yeah, I go over in Louisville." And I says, "Well, what church do you go to in Louisville?" And he said, "Well, Sojourn." "Well, that's where I know you from. I go to Sojourn." And I says, "You're not wearing your hat," because I always recognized him with his hat, his Korean War hat. And somehow or another that connected us pretty quick. We realized we went to church together. But I remember that first visit with him at his home, and he wanted me to sit down and talk with him. And the first thing he told me was I was baptized when I was a child. I used to read the Bible every day, or a lot of the days, and I would go to church whenever I could. And it's interesting as a chaplain, is that when a hospice chaplain especially, is that when you meet somebody for that first time, there's really no more facades, okay? There's no more beating around the bush, because they know if they're coming on hospice that time is limited. I mean, it could be for a while, but we never know. And that's the impression I got with James. My first encounter there at his home was he wanted me to know that he was okay with God. And that was important to him. He went on to tell me that when he was in Korea, that he would have long visits with the chaplain there and talk about the Lord and talk about things. But that really spoke to me. Yesterday I had the opportunity to meet with Marjorie and Charlene and to learn more about James and how he built his life. He really was an amazing man. He was full of adventure, and he was real down to earth. You saw James, that's who he was, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you could imagine a man that watched Bugs Bunny for 28 years and laughed at the Bugs Bunny cartoons. That's the story, that he loved Bugs Bunny. He loved puppies, and he loved kittens, and he loved his family. You know, when he shared with me, he began his story, and he just opened it up like a book. And he started talking about Tennessee. He told me about his parents, and he told me how he was raised. And from Tennessee, we went to Kansas. And he told me about his life in Kansas. And then he went into the war. And he told me how he was in a chow line, and he's just waiting to get some grub. And next thing you know, he's face first on the ground with shrapnel on his backside. "By friendly fire," he said. "By friendly fire," that's what he told me. And he just got stuck on it, you know. And so then he went, I think he went to Hawaii after that, if I'm getting the story correct. And he talked about Hawaii some. And so I asked him a question just to hear more of his story. And then we started back in Tennessee. And we got back in Tennessee, and then we went back to Kansas, and then we went back to the Korean War, and then we went to Hawaii again. So I dare ask another question. We went back to Tennessee, and we went back. But you know what was so beautiful about each time we went to Tennessee, the picture got a little bit bigger. You know,